It is Thursday, January 10th, 2019. My name is Ashton Ellet, here with a special 2018 election installment of the two-party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Max Blau. Max is an award-winning Atlanta-based journalist writing for Atlanta Magazine, Bitter Southerner, Politico, and the New York Times, among others. Before becoming a freelance journalist, he worked as a Southern correspondent for Boston Globe's National Health and Science site, STAT. Max has also worked as a writer for CNN.com, Atlanta Magazine, and Creative Loafing. He is also a graduate of Emory University, as well as the University of Georgia's Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication. Thanks, Max, for taking some of your morning out to talk politics with us.
Thanks for having me.
I really do appreciate it. Since this is your first time sitting for a two-party Georgia interview, tell us a little bit about your childhood growing up.
I was born in Evanston, Illinois, and spent the first 18 years of my life living in Chicago and outside of the city there.
Okay.
Mostly on the north side.
Sure.
Was raised by my father, who he was born in Israel, so I was the first in my family to be born in the U.S. On that side, and he was a book publisher. I grew up around a lot of books. He was Jewish. My biological mother was Catholic, so I had this experience growing up of being having the most Jewish experience at a Catholic school. And then I came down to Emory when I was 18. Mm-hmm. And was the most Catholic person at a school that has a large Jewish population there. So I had this experience that was largely defined by religion in some way, shape, or form at the schools I went to. And I think as I went to high school, which was at Loyola Academy in Wilmette, Illinois, it was Jesuit high school, and there, while I kind of pushed away religion, and kind of wanted to be as far away from that as possible, just given the complexities of the experience I was going through, trying to figure out grapple with both the Jewish and Catholic parts of my upbringing. One of the things I did take away from that was just the social justice element that comes in a school like a Jesuit school.
Right.
A lot of the learning, even if it was faith classes, it was on just war theory and things, like philosophy that aligned, that kind of philosophy that looked at some of the political issues of the day. When I was in high school, it was about 2002 through 2006. So in the middle of post 9/11, the war on terror beginning, and we were having conversations on that from the Christian philosophical perspective or Catholic philosophical perspective, and of course at that same time we were the sex scandal, the national church sex scandal was happening with priests, and that was coming to light, and as always in a Jesuit Catholic school, death penalty comes up and questions that align at the intersection of politics and faith. And back then, I had few ambitions to be a political journalist in any way, but the issues that I was grappling with in the school like that, I think looking back, helped me grapple with many of the intersection of politics and religion or culture down here that so defined Georgia politics, in the past, particularly 2 decades. I mean, even going back much further.
Right. So what drew you down to Emory?
When I was in...
You didn't go to Northwestern.
Yeah. It was the school that, at that time, I wanted to go to a business school in a city of a decent size. I didn't want to be in a college town in the middle of a cornfield in the Midwest. And the choice was to go to Indiana University or to Emory. And I think I picked Emory, like many colleges.
Bloomington wouldn't get you away from the corn.
No, not necessarily.
That's your problem.
Though I like Bloomington now, having actually been there. But it was I wanted to go to the city, and being like many college kids, looked through the book of best ranked schools, and Emory was up there, and decided to visit. And when I came down here, I loved the campus, and just like it was in the summer, so I didn't really know what it was actually like during the school year, but it was it ended up being just like what I thought was the right choice at the time.
Right.
And I while I didn't Emory, I had good and bad experiences at Emory. I feel like without that I would have not ended up in Atlanta or stayed in Atlanta.
So what drew you to journalism, since you had planned to go down a business BA, business administration route?
So I didn't study journalism or really consider it throughout most of my undergraduate. I was the first 2 years of my time at Emory, I was on a track to apply to the business school, which you did in your third year.
Right.
And then I got in, and then decided I didn't want to be doing accounting or finance or things like that. Take 2 more years of that. So I switched over to sociology, and I ultimately graduated with a double major in sociology and economics. And at that time, sociology, of course, there are traditional courses on things like class and power and income inequality. Sure. But the thing I really focused on was related to the intersection of art and commerce, and how those two forces interacted with each other. And the simple way of, that was everything from studying protests, music, to, why a Taylor Swift 3-minute pop song can make, X million of dollars, but then a song with the same chord structure may be obscure and never go heard of. And what are some of the institutions or industry forces that make those two have different paths?
Okay.
I in my senior year, I had written some music and concert reviews for like the zine at Emory and for the Emory Wheel, but it wasn't until like my way into writing about politics came through being a music and entertainment journalist first, but taking not necessarily just doing like song reviews, but writing like trying to write media profiles of artists grappling with health, like lack of health insurance, or lack of just why musicians overdose, and like not just like I did a series of stories early in my career that looked at musicians like Jason Molina, who is a songwriter from Chicago, who was one of the first artists on an influential Bloomington, Indiana label that led to one of the largest indie labels today that has released music from Bon Iver and Sharon Van Etten and Grammy Award winners. He was this artist that without him, they might not have had the careers they did on the labels that brought them to fame. But he was someone who struggled with alcohol use disorder, and a lot of that was complicated by the fact he was a musician without insurance, and who often got paid in bar tabs and things like that. So, I was exploring the stripping away just like the idea of sex, drugs, rock and roll and the glorification of drug use. Not that there's anything wrong with people who use alcohol or drugs, but I was interested in seeing like what are these specific steps that lead someone to ultimately die from and not achieve the acclaim they could have gotten otherwise. And through writing stories like that and having an interest in that, that's ultimately what got I jumped over to creative loafing after doing that for Paste magazine and then a bunch of other different places.
Well, how would you compare working as a staff writer, as you said, for Creative Loafing, and then later for Atlanta and CNN, to the freelance journalism that you do now?
It's more stable. Aside from knowing your paycheck's coming every 2 weeks,
Sure.
I think the difference is I get to jump to select assignments that I want to go on. So. And some days, I might be getting a call from the New York Times asking me to go on a day's notice to earlier this year. One of the assignments I got like this was on a day's notice go down to the Brian Kemp rally in Macon that was in July, right before he beat Casey Cagle,
Right.
Where Mike Pence was there, and it was this moment, as you may hear from other people talk in other journalists there. That was really the first time it felt like you knew Kemp was going to beat Casey Cagle for sure. I think a lot of people saw the writing on the wall, but
Right.
it wasn't quite clear if Cagle would still somehow overcome the Lindsey Tippins tape and all of that. But it was this moment in the middle of the Macon Coliseum complex that just like it had an energy I hadn't seen in Georgia politics in a very long time, and others like Greg Bluestein might have more of a insight to whether that moment came a little bit before. But as someone who was not in the day-to-day, but maybe every quarter would be at a political rally or kind of take the temperature of how different campaigns were going, that was a moment that really struck me. In Republican politics, at least, as a unifying moment. You were seeing a wide range of Republicans back Kemp there, and so you have moments like this where I get in the car on a short notice and drive down and just get thrown into an environment that I wasn't expecting to 2 days before, and then you're also working on projects that sometimes take that are of your own choosing that could last a year or two. An example of that is just like the work I've been doing with the Bitter Southerner in and about English Avenue and Vine City and the impacts of the Mercedes-Benz Stadium on those neighborhoods. In addition to a story I published in 2018 about what it was a close look at one family that had 10 people living in a 2-bedroom house without running water, and there's a story of a grandma named Shaquille Ogletree, her second act of parenthood, trying to raise 6 grandchildren under the age of 11 after 4 of her own children had struggled with everything from addiction to incarceration to prostitution, how she was grappling and fighting to reinstill hope for the next generation in her family. And doing this all on a fixed income and without a stable sense of money coming into the house on a regular basis. From that all the way to, in a couple of weeks, we have Dustin Chambers, my collaborator on that series, and I are publishing with Bitter Southerner an oral history on Lightning, which is the neighborhood that used to exist before the Congress Center and Georgia Dome, and now Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Now that swath of land used to be one of Atlanta's oldest working class African American communities, and ceases to exist today. And on February 3rd, when tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people come to Atlanta, either to go to the game or just to be here for the Super Bowl, there's no marker, there's no record of that neighborhood. So this story is good. We've been tracking down former residents of Lightning who are scattered across the metro Atlanta area and the South, and bringing that neighborhood back to life and showing people like what was, not that there's anything wrong with stadiums, but here is what happens when we build stadiums. And that's been a really fascinating process, just seeing, not only seeing that neighborhood come to life, but also seeing the politics of the day. This is one part of that we're focusing on is like the late 80s and the interactions of the state and the city with Mayor Andrew Young and Governor Joe Frank Harris and Lieutenant Governor Zell Miller. Like there's this moment at the Georgia groundbreaking that's like this beautiful, like it's this nasty rainy November day where, you have in a single tent, because they couldn't do it outside, Harris, Miller, Young, and Mayor-elect Maynard Jackson coming back for his third term, like having their like a host of like fancy like shrimp scampi and like this whole thing, and then in comes 100 protesters from like the concerned black clergy, and you have people like Timothy McDonald and McKinley Young, people that would time and time again would show up at the Capitol or City Hall, like raising hell and demanding that churches get more money. So even if they're going to be displaced, they can have enough money to be relocated somewhere else.
Right.
And so I get like both random calls to do assignments some days, but also have the autonomy to choose the projects I want to do and then go to a publication and ask them if they want to publish it. Whereas on staff, I was still covering things I wanted to, but there was more, I wasn't able to sometimes not always dive as deep as often as I wanted to, or I was covering things that I might be assigned that weren't necessarily of interest to me.
So are political stories something that you choose to do, or has most of your experience been through assignments?
I think I was nudged very early on at Creative Loafing they had gone through a series of layoffs earlier in the early part of 2012, and I joined staff there started in September of 2012, and I had been doing some freelancing for them previous to that, but prior to that. At first I thought I was asked to do cover City Hall and City Council, and I thought I was going to hate that, candidly. My editor, Thomas Wheatley, had lost, he had moved up into an editor role after his boss, who was the City Hall correspondent, more or less, was laid off, and I kind of inherited that job just by being there on staff, and they needed someone to cover that. And City Hall is just a place that I came to love reporting about. I think it's one of the most fascinating buildings in Georgia to cover, not just because it's the largest local government building or the largest city hall in Georgia, but it's also, once you get to know the lay of the land there on issues, there's this complexity that exists in that building and really in that 4 square block area, that I became largely obsessed with for 3 years, and not so much in I never really cared about the day-to-day blow by blow of how bills pass at the Capitol, or whether or not, I think I probably hate writing about the committee of advancing the bill to the process. I am fascinated by the process of how a bill gets made, but I don't want to write the same story seven times and write the
sausage making story.
Exactly. I have deep respect for people like when I was going to the Capitol, it was people like Jonathan Shapiro at WABE and Aaron Sheinin at the HAC who were doing that kind of work, or Christina Torres, and relied on their reporting to inform some of my longer or more step back pieces. But that was something I was never really interested in. But politics were something the way I viewed politics is the way I ended up viewing healthcare at Stat, or the way I view, inequality now. And I think inequality is something that can be both a political and a healthcare story. But any of those topics, I think, are just ways to tell human stories. And I think, we often define politics as what happens in a Republican or Democratic Party, but I think you could tell any kind of story, any kind of story is politics, really.
Right.
And I think the more you stop thinking about it in terms of what's happening on this day, and do we have enough votes with the Republican or Democratic Party to pick something up, but is this going to, how is this going to impact someone in Stewart County, Georgia, or up on the opposite side of the state in Augusta? What does this mean for when we talk about Plant Vogel, for instance?
Right.
What does it mean for the people living directly next to it in Shell Bluff? I'm interested in more of how the people at the exact opposite end of, the farthest away from the Gold Dome or City Hall, but who are most directly going to be impacted by a project. How is it going to affect those people? And I always found reporting from a ground-up perspective to be more interesting than what was happening with the sausage being made, as you said.
So taking that into account, how did you cover and what did you take away from the 2016 election here in Georgia? What were you covering and how did you write about it?
That fall I was at CNN, and I was the night of the election. I was in the newsroom, and that was really one of these. I haven't talked a whole lot about this, but this is I think there's for most people watching journalism or just journalists, like there's it would make sense to go from like a small publication to a larger one, and I was, I thought CNN was going to be a step up for me, and I had some people who there are phenomenal journalists at CNN, but the moment I learned CNN wasn't a place that I could do the kind of journalism I was interested in was election night 2016, and I was at the time an overnight writer, so I would go in at 10:30 at night and write till 6:30 in the morning, 5 days a week. If you in that period, if you were looking at like Apple News or on some app device and waking up in the morning, you were reading probably a story I touched the night before, and that could have been anything from an international story, in the invasion of Mosul to people accusing the president of something on the campaign trail. The now president, but I sat in that newsroom, and I was called in as like an extra body. In large newsrooms like that, they overstaff, hoping just in case they need more people to cover, to help with the coverage, even though election nights, once they get going, are largely a process of waiting for things to come, for votes to come in, and it moves pretty slowly. It's just a long night, especially if you're in Fulton County.
Yes.
But and a lot of the writing for CNN.com's team was was at a desk in the CNN headquarters in Atlanta, and I was attached to a desk that night. I remember, like, even though I had the experience to cover politics, I've been doing it for 4 or 5 years at that point. I was someone who was relegated more or less to the sidelines. So I was on Slack messaging an editor in DC asking, like, do you need any help? Do you need any help? And it was something like, no, we're covered at this point in time, up until like midnight or 1, and that's when all the good stuff started happening. But they cut before that, and I just remember sitting, thinking a lot that night, especially as we found out who our president was, and just thinking that this place wasn't right for me, and I needed to get back to what I was doing before and what I've been doing since, in terms of, talking with the people affected by politics or the people affected by healthcare or any other large issue. And I think to bring that home, and like an example of that is this month in the Atlanta Magazine, January issue of the Atlanta Magazine, I have a feature on the old way I might have reported, like the Hurricane Michael hitting Georgia was to cover the special session maybe, but instead I spent that time, or that several week period, like down in different parts of the state, like following around pecan farmers. And I found pecan farmers really fascinating, because here's this group of farmers that not only lost one crop, but they're going to lose potentially a decade's worth of crops, because it takes about a decade for the trees to harvest, to yield nuts again. And you have these families that have passed down pecan growing for generations. So I was able to find three different families, and the story's kind of structured as one where the first one's talking about the grandfather still in retirement, working on his pecan farms, and Bainbridge, Georgia, or just outside of Bainbridge, and then followed like a teenager on the other end of a different family who's going to be inheriting that someday, and what does that look like for these families that are not only affected by a physical storm, but are in the middle of a, getting hit by a 47% tariff on pecans, and does that mean like the crop that Georgia is one of Georgia's most iconic crops? Do we lose that title or that prestige of Georgia pecans in the years to come, because people, like, most pecans now are bought by Chinese buyers, and if they're not going to be getting them from Georgia because of the tariffs, and which has so far been the case, what does that mean for like the people like that are closest to the soil?
I mean, I guess we could wait to read the piece, but is that an issue that you discussed or brought up? Were the larger political, economic implications emanating from Washington and getting their feelings on those, like the tariff and things?
Yeah, I mean, like that was on, like, most of them. It was those two things simultaneously, right. Plus just the slow reckoning with climate change, and what is it actually, like, there were pieces around this time. I think Glenn Thrush from the New York Times did this really excellent piece on, how other kinds of farmers were looking at like climate change, and if the series of storms that hit Georgia in the past 3 years, Hurricane Matthew, Irma, and then Michael, if farmers were changing their plans, and some were still denying that climate change was not an issue. And with pecan farmers, you're starting to see a little bit of that, or that, the people who are largely in Trump's, political base. This, one of the farmers I chatted with was the father of another pecan farmer who Pence visited when he came down here. So it was like in the reddest parts of the state, people, seeing the effects of increasingly powerful storms firsthand, and trying to make sense of that too. So you have this intersection of the politics of climate change, the politics of a trade war that, on one hand, farmers want the U.S. to win and believe in their country deeply, but on the other hand, they see there was never a better time to be a pecan farmer because of a combination of agricultural engineering in the just like the perfect the past decade or so. It's just been like a really good time in terms of temperature to grow pecans. And China's just been in the past 20 years has bought larger and larger amounts of pecans as their middle class has grown. And it's something in China where they, much like we eat peanuts and crack them open, they kind of do the same thing with the pecans. It's increasingly becoming a staple of their diets, and especially as more people have more income there. And what happens when someone just says, we're going to have this trade war, but not give? These are farmers that don't get subsidies like soybean farmers or any kind of bailout. So they're, the 47% doesn't just mean like it's more expensive for China to get pecans, but it's also just means China's not buying pecans from the U.S. or from Georgia farmers at all. They're going to other countries and finding, for them, pecans that are going to be cheaper. So. Issues like that, I gravitated towards just because, like at the Capitol, what does it really mean when we pass, several $100 million of aid for farmers? What does that actually mean when we have a special session, the only ones in Governor Deal's 8 years in office? And then politicians go back home and say, we passed this, we're doing right by you. What does the things happening in Atlanta mean in the Gold Dome mean to the people on the other end of once those policies are implemented? And so whether that is pecans or prisons or nuclear energy, or voting, the voting rights and the ability to vote in a way that makes sense for Georgians. Like these really complex issues that get, that get debated and talked about at the Capitol or at City Hall or any other government building. What does it mean when people pass laws that, people who sometimes aren't experts in those topics,
Sure.
pass laws that then affect just average Georgians? Like, that is really what I care about. And I think, if anything, freelancing has allowed me to like dive deeper into the lives of people like the farmers I'm talking about.
So were you able to cover the 2018 cycle in a way that you weren't able to cover sort of the 2016 election when you were at CNN?
Yeah, in 2018, I did probably, I would say 3 or 4 different stories. Part of it, being a freelancer, part of the job is finding out who needs, political reporting, and who, obviously that's an area a lot of places staffed up. So, I am not, I was not being someone who, it was not demanded of me to be going to every single rally or kind of doing the horse race, and I was glad for that. I did 4 pieces that I can think of related to the campaign, in addition to just like tweeting about it or talking out, providing information to other people that follow me on Twitter. But I as I mentioned earlier, I went and covered this for the New York Times, this rally in July of 2018. That was right before Pence won the became the Republican nominee for governor. I did a pair of AJC stories similar to the way, like in the ethos I described a second ago. One was going down to Stewart County, Georgia. I found Stewart County to be this really fascinating place because in a single county, you could tell the story of both campaigns' efforts to convince rural voters to vote for them. It was an issue. Stewart County lost in 2013. It was one of the 7 or 8 rural hospitals that have closed statewide since 2013. Stewart Webster Hospital had closed down in 2012 or 2013, and this is a county that was grappling with the shortage of doctors and the shortage of healthcare providers. No longer did they have a hospital in their own county. They had to go sometimes an hour away to Columbus or, if they were lucky, to Americus, in the moment where someone's having a heart attack, or and in the county that only has like 1 or 2 ambulances, like people were dying because of a hospital closing down. And so on one hand, you had an Abrams platform that was looking at expanding Medicaid and really tackling the rural hospital issue. And on the other hand, you had Brian Kemp talking about a rural broadband issue, and as one of the top priorities for revitalizing Georgia economies. And so Stewart County was one of the counties with the when you look at the digital divide throughout the South and throughout Georgia. Researchers at the Carl Vinson Institute had put out a map that looked at the counties with the least amount of broadband access, and Stewart County was one that had, I want to say it was only like 5% had the kind of broadband access that would allow them to like stream multiple devices at the same time in a home. So, these are counties, just to put into picture what that looks like where people describe to me like kids after school going outside, as it was getting dark, like sitting in the parking lots or sitting in libraries, outside of libraries, just to use the Wi-Fi so they can do certain things. But you can't even while schools there have internet, there is you can't just go home and do your homework on the internet like many of us probably had grown up having the access to. So in this one county, you're able to tell the story of both priorities and of the respective campaigns in terms of catering to rural Georgia. The third story I did was on Black gun owners. When it comes to politics stories, like I like stories that don't have clear narratives, like one way or the other. And I think like with this Black gun owner story, I was able to find, on one hand, in a state where identity politics is a very real thing, and where there are overtones on many campaigns for vote for me because I am white or because I am Black, even if the politicians aren't saying that directly. There was, Abrams was fascinating to me in the sense that, there was in terms of the turnout she was able to get in terms of African-American voters, took as strong of a position as she did on gun rights, or on restricting, having universal background checks, and laying out a very liberal, progressive stance on Second Amendment issues. And so looking at African-American, I'd written a story a couple of years ago about the NRA's relationship to Black gun owners, and how on one hand, the NRA is clearly a very white, conservative organization in terms of its base of members, but also are seeing the fault lines of, several decades from now, we will be a majority-minority nation, and we're on track to be a majority-minority nation. And how do you, having been a white Christian conservative organization predominantly, how do you cater to the next generation of what America is going to look like? And there's a long history of Black gun ownership in Georgia, in this country, that was a way of defending against the KKK or other threats of white supremacy, and people who both identify with issues that are important to African American communities, as well as ones that they can go to the gun range and shoot next to their people they have nothing in common with ideologically. So this story was looking at perspectives of Black gun owners that were voting both for Kemp and for Abrams, and looking at how they were making sense of that campaign, where their politics, when you look at the full range of their politics and what they believed in, didn't line up with either candidate 100%, and how that was influencing their votes. And the final piece was this profile I did of Jim Galloway, which was I guess it was, this might be his last this might have been his last governor's race, and I was interested in just doing a media profile on the chief, so and in the context of the 2018 election, and how he was covering it, and what this looked like compared to everything else he's covered since the late 70s.
Since you have studied about and written about sort of that rural-urban divide that has always been there in Georgia politics, but it was probably more pronounced in 2018 than it has been in quite a long time. What do you think is the root structural cause of that divide, and how is it's manifested itself in politics?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I know I don't know where to start with that.
Well, I don't know if there's a clear cut
no,
yes, no answer.
I think it's there's elements of race, there's elements of class in there. There's I think as long as I've been covering politics, which and having chatted with a generation before me, and then seeing and studying the evolution of the way, in particular, like the relationship between Atlanta and Georgia has changed over time. I think there's, on one hand, there's I think there's been, you may have heard this from other journalists or other people, but there is this Atlanta-Georgia divide that has long existed, that in which Atlanta, despite being the largest city in the and the thing that has, a city that is a cradle of the civil rights movement. It is a black mecca in one of the black meccas of the country. Has long struggled to get what it believes to be are the resources it needs from the capital that is in Atlanta, and a lot of that has to do with this idea that from rural Georgia lawmakers outside of Atlanta that they're not getting their fair share. And I think there's this, like with everything else in Georgia politics, I think race is one reason for why that exists. I think there is that divide that's become more complicated as you have obviously pockets of rural Georgia that are largely concentrated African American. I think
the Black Belt.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's as rural Georgia, particularly white rural Georgians, I think, as over the past generation, I think as like manufacturing jobs and the economy has changed throughout the South, I think opportunities that could have been career ones, I'm thinking of like average factory towns throughout the South, or
right.
Even farming opportunities, like the loss of small farms. I think as like the ability to like carve out a path and a decent life for your family has eroded or been removed out of one's own individual control. I think the privilege of being able to do that in the past, or the opportunity to do that, is something that causes great anxiety. And how could it not for people that's all who only knew that and only wanted to pass on the American dream to their family and to their family. I think that, of course, has to be put in the context when we're talking about like the anxieties of white working class people versus African Americans who without going into the full history of why
right.
why that exists, like there is to some degree there is a privilege that white working class people had, even above black working class people in that had the same skills and the same levels of income even. But I think that sort of rural-urban divide, you started seeing it come about, of course, with the Trump's victory, and then in the special election for Sessions' seat in Alabama, you were seeing the dog whistles and kind of this catering to people who have lost opportunity that we're going to protect this or bring this back. And I think you saw that again in 2018 with Brian Kemp, starting with the truck, they round them up and put them in the back of your truck, illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants in the back of your truck. And that continued to be an issue, throughout this election. And I think that is something that I'm really fascinated to see where that intersection of like urban and rural divide, but also how we grapple with the politics of race that have long defined Georgia politics. Like how do those two continue to look moving forward beyond 2018? I don't know if that answered your question.
No. It brings me to my next point, which is, apart from the rural-urban divide, one of the major stories of 2018, as it was with 2016, was the transition of the suburbs from sort of a core element of the Republican electoral coalition to perhaps it's becoming blue to, in 2018, clearly at least the older suburbs have shifted politically. What do you think's behind that relatively rapid shift of the Cobb counties, of the Gwinnett counties, of Henry County, from a red to a blue county?
I think part of it is the changing dynamic of who is in Atlanta and who is living in Atlanta. Atlanta is a city that has, like myself, is full of transplants, and a city that, as the city of Atlanta struggles with an affordable housing crisis, especially coming out of the in the years after the Great Recession, I think you've seen a combination of transplants from other cities that were more expensive moving into the city, and people more people moving back in town, almost like the next step of the reversal of white flight, almost in some cases. This combination of people moving into the core of Atlanta, pushing poorer people out to the suburbs in many cases. I think that is one side of it. Of course, you also have on the other side, people who were centrists. There's a lot of talk in this campaign about white women who were independent or Republican leaning, but were maybe considered undersided in the past. Seeing a president, seeing the manifestation of and the consequences of having a white male in office who had a horrible track record for treating women, and much of which came out in not only in the campaign in 2016, but in the 2 years afterwards. And I think that was people who were marching, going up to Washington to march, in the Women's March and things like that. I think you had these coalitions of African American people that used to live in Atlanta moving to new places, plus younger white women. Those two forces, I think, especially in a place like Cobb County, are what helped that dramatically shift as fast as it did. I think, and that's also not. I think that is the parts that I'm really focused on and more interested in are the way. But given that I cover Atlanta, and one of the things I've been covering more in recent years is housing, and looking at how one of the reasons why there's been this diaspora of low-income residents out of the city of Atlanta, whether that's to farther south to Clayton or to Henry or to the northeast or to the northeast to Gwinnett or to Cobb, is a long tail impact of the destruction of public housing in Atlanta, combined with the fact of when you had that plus the foreclosure crisis plus rising cost to stay in the city of Atlanta as renters. I think you're seeing a lot of the people who were living in the city 10 or 20 years ago being quietly a part of that blue wave, in addition to the shifting left of white women voters, which I'm sure Jim Galloway or other agency folks have given a lot of service to that idea.
Do you think these are trends, because you've already identified that these are longer-term structural trends, at least in terms of demographic shifts in Cobb, Gwinnett, Clayton? Do you think the shift of especially college-educated white women out of the Republican Party, do you think that's a trend that survives Donald Trump, or do you think this is just sort of a disrupting event in politics?
I think a lot of that depends on how the Republican Party chooses to, how they choose to identify or to move forward in terms of who they want as a part of their party. I think this is a conversation that has been happening with the Republican Party as long as I've been an adult, going back to, I remember this happening with Latino voters in the 2000s, and do you open up the tent and bring in more Catholic or Cuban Americans, and those are conversations I remember happening 10 or 15 years ago, and that's not the first time that's happened, I'm sure. I think a lot of it depends on Georgia is a state that is going to has projected to be to become a majority-minority state by 2024 since I've been covering politics. That was always the marker in time. Whether or not that happens, we'll see in 2024. But that'll happen either that year or 2028 or 2032 in terms of a future governor's race. And I think similarly, this nation is supposed to be one that is on track to become majority minority in 2047. And I think, the question is like, with white women as well as anyone else, like how does the Republican Party, adapt to the future as opposed to holding on to vestiges of the past in terms of catering to a largely white base?
Voting access, voting rights, voter suppression, I mean, those were sort of all-encompassing stories that were, or ever-present stories would probably be a better way to describe it. What was your take on the dynamic of voting access, voting suppression in 2018, and what does that tell us about those conversations we're going to be having in the years going forward?
It was one of the things I covered at Creative Loafing, not knowing it would be like the proxy fight for the governor's mansion in 2018 when I was doing it, but it was started with the New Georgia Project.
Right.
It was in October 2014. This was in the middle of the Carter deal race that was still at the time seemed pretty close, despite the fact it ended up being, I think, an 8 or 9 point margin.
Yeah.
And it was, I still remember this day. It's the opening scene of this long New Georgia Project story that I would write several months later of then Majority Leader Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock and Francis Johnson, who was at the time the head of Georgia's NAACP, standing in the steps inside the Capitol, and they had these big white boxes with blue and light, or like neon blue and neon pink tops, and each of them on the front showed a county name, and they were, these were tens of thousands of votes that they said weren't getting, people that couldn't register to vote.
So we were talking about the New Georgia Project and their sort of interactions with the Secretary of State's office and the Georgia Elections Board.
Yeah, so I was just describing like the scene at the Capitol in 2014, and ultimately what had happened at that time was that then Secretary of State Brian Kemp had subpoenaed documents and started to look into the New Georgia Project, which was this effort by Stacey Abrams, outside of her role as the House Minority Leader, to help register voters. Later on, she would say it was an effort that I think was trying to get 600,000 to 800,000 people, 200,000 registered and 600 to 800 out to the polls that were low propensity voters in the past, and particularly minority voters in Georgia, or minority residents of Georgia, where the demographic they were targeting, in an effort just to kind of combat like years of voter suppression and whether it was in like specific initiatives or just like disinterest because people thought they couldn't impact or affect change through going to the polls. But the Kemp's office had over what later was a very small number, a fraction of the tens of thousands of people the Abrams team and New Georgia Project team were trying to get to the polls. Like a handful of them were there was issues with them, whether they were fraudulent. I think there was some incorrect, these were $10 to $15 an hour canvassers making mistakes in the field, but was played up as a very large thing to look into that the state board had to have an emergency hearing over. And there's this big press conference where Abrams and Warnock and Johnson all were blasting even back then, we're calling Brian Kemp an extremist Secretary of State, and claiming that he was trying to stop this effort that was hoping to turn Georgia blue. And this became for 4 years. 4 years later, would come up again in the 2018 election as a as the two battle back and forth. It was ultimately while the New Georgia Project was an independent project started by Abrams in those first 2 years after this press conference, she kind of kept her distance from it. She was not necessarily, she was the founder of it, but this group went on their own and raised a lot of millions of dollars, and was a way, almost like while it was, they were doing the work of trying to register voters, it was also a way for Abrams to kind of quietly build up a base that would allow her to point and say, I'm doing this kind of work as a candidate in 2017 and 2018, and similarly it came up again as Kemp used it as ammo against her down the line when the two emerged from their respective primaries to go head to head in the final months of the governor's race. But the New Georgia Project was this really fascinating thing because you had these two kind of mid-tier politicians at that time going at it, and ultimately, there was what my report found. It was with Creative Loafing, and when it was published in early 2015, was that it raised questions about the work that Abrams had actually done in terms of raising those 51,000 applications that she said were not being processed for 2014. The campaign never let anyone actually see them to prove that they existed. There was never, they never allowed anyone from the outside, journalists or otherwise, to look at that. And simultaneously, there were questions about the way Abrams was operating, paying staff with a combination of, 501c4 and C3 money, which should technically be one for nonprofit, nonpartisan efforts, right, and the other being for lobbying efforts. And kind of, there's just questions about the work that she had actually done or accomplished through that project. But nevertheless, that didn't stop New Georgia Project from raising even more money nationally, and it was kind of one of the vehicles that I think ultimately allowed her to have some of the more national reach from a fundraising perspective that she would go on, that would drive her campaign in 2018.
Yeah, I remember on election night, one of the big stories that developed throughout the day were problems at predominantly urban, predominantly African American and minority voting places and precincts. Why were there these exceedingly long lines in Metro Atlanta, especially Fulton County, such that every election it seems that the federal courts order the polling places to stay open? What gives there? Is it a lack of resources, lack of planning, local versus state issue? What gives there?
I think it's incredibly complex, and it is. But I think on that specific day, you were seeing reports of in some places there not being enough working machines. Elsewhere, people would show up to a polling location, but it would be mismarked, and they'd have to go. There actually people were not. It was not clear that the early voting location was the same as the day of election day, the day of the election polling place. And in Gwinnett, I remember seeing reports of lack of translators in some places, or not enough, like there being, in a county like Gwinnett that has the immigrant population that it does. Not only does is there the impact of not enough working machines or just understaffed polling places, but there's also making sure people know what's going on and being able to have unbiased translators. I've chatted with there's a couple of advocacy groups I know that were doing work around that in Gwinnett. Those are some of the things I was hearing. This election, I was not actually working on election necessarily, but but those were issues. I mean, even before that, there were, and this is still going on, concerns about what to do regarding Georgia's like nearly 2-decade-old, 16-year-old voting machines, and like ones that are at a time where we have national concerns about whether our election results are going to be compromised by other nations, including Russia. How secure are our ballots? And there are questions as to whether or not we should be using paper again or staying with electronic ballots. And some of those are. That conversation is continuing to this day, and will continue probably until Georgia invests in some new kind of infrastructure.
Were you surprised at how relatively close the election was at the end of the day?
Yes. Yes and no. I didn't. I'm one of the people that I think until Georgia actually turns blue, see it from my own eyes. I don't know. I just can't imagine that. So even despite the energy both around Abrams and John Ossoff, who ran for the 6th Congressional District in 2017, having seen the way people get excited about a general election, but then don't always act and go to the polls. I didn't know if Abrams would be able to get as close as she did. I was surprised at the end of the day. I still think ultimately, when we talk about the states, while not all white people vote for white people, not all black people vote for black people, I figured the day that Georgia would turn blue would be much closer to the day that Georgia becomes a majority minority state. Right. So I thought this year would be premature for that to happen, and maybe next time around or the one after that. It is something I've been. That's one of the most fascinating questions moving forward. Is on a local level in Atlanta. Atlanta's on the cusp of becoming no longer being a majority black city, and that'll probably change in the next 5 to 10 years if it hasn't already, which we'll know in the 2020 census.
Right.
But and then Georgia is also to the point you were making earlier, just like with the suburbs, increasingly turning blue. I think that's a signal that as Atlanta becomes more of a wider progressive and left-leaning center, I'm curious to see how, as we approach that date that Georgia becomes a majority minority state, what that means for, whether it's Abrams running again in 3 years now, or someone else. I'm curious to see how that turns out. As you probably have chatted about with some other folks, I think, one of the first tests to this was, this question of, does someone like Stacey Evans who seemed to be adopting a more moderate stance during her campaign for the Democratic nomination, and taking one that had trying to do a better job at a strategy that had failed in years past. Hers was, of course, tailored around her strengths in education and the Hope Scholarship, and one that could have potentially bridged rural and urban divide, versus, but one that taking still a similar strategy to what Jason Carter had done 4 years earlier.
Sort of Roy Barnes approach.
Yeah, that
to
approach.
Georgia politics.
I was really fascinated by that the difference between that and the unapologetic progressive agenda that Stacey Abrams had, just because I didn't know if Georgia would be ready to elect someone like that statewide. And so I was surprised, first seeing the route of how badly Stacey Evans lost was, the margin was shocking to me there.
Right.
And that's when that was a sign to me that the race could be more competitive than the Jason Carter one. Not that Jason Carter was an interesting candidate, but he wasn't the drawing out the same kinds of crowds or having the same excitement as the Evans campaign or as the Abrams campaign started to have over the course of the second and third quarters of 2018. So,
do you think there's a future for the sort of Stacey Evans, Roy Barnes, Jason Carter approach to politics, or approach to Democratic politics, or is the future that sort of progressive, base-centric approach that Stacey Abrams really succeeded?
I think I used to think that was the way forward, but Trump has been such a disruptive force in American politics that I think in the short to medium term, probably not. I think we're going to get more divided or have more polarization in future statewide races before we go back to that. I think we're going to probably we're going to see, similar kinds of races moving forward before we find another Barnes. Because that's been the dynamic at the Capitol for a long time. Anyway, like just on a state lawmaker in the way bills are made. And while there are plenty of people who like to talk about bipartisanship in state politics in Georgia, I just don't see us. It would take someone really special and unique that I haven't seen in coming up through the ranks of either party at this point in time to be so unifying that I just don't think that person exists right now, or in the dynamic and the political climate doesn't incentivize anyone to take that route.
What do you think? Looking at, I believe the governor is inaugurated today, next week.
I think next week. Yeah.
Next week. What do you think? Coming out of the election, he's staffed up. He has his floor leaders now. What do you think Brian Kemp is going to bring to Georgia politics that's been different from when you were covering Nathan Deal or Sonny Perdue before that?
I think that the $1 million question is, like, how does he actually govern? Is he going to be a partisan politician who runs the governor's mansion in the way he ran his campaign? I forget if it was one of the New York Times correspondents that used the word countrified to describe him as this Athens.
Yeah, countrified.
Yeah,
Athens
this guy who was trying to play up the more country parts of his public persona, when in reality he wasn't that in everyday life. So how does the campaign trail reflect the reality of him as a governor? That I think we have seen, while Governor Deal has, his 8 years in office have been widely celebrated, and he has gotten this they're widely celebrated kind of across the state as this coalition builder and someone who, even though he was a Republican, was able to move forward an agenda that, with issues like criminal justice, helped made Georgia a better state in some issues. I think there's a lot of criticisms you can find about his legacy, of course, but in ones that are, but one that rebuilt the Georgia economy and did things that at the end of those 8 years, whatever qualms you had about him, he left the state in some cases in a better place. There's, Medicaid expansion is I think going to be ultimately the thing that dogs his legacy when we look back 8 years from now, and the ways in which that, But the question I think is does Kemp govern like Deal and try to strike a middle of the road as a Republican, or does he go, does he mirror Trump and go talking about gangs and doing things that will pushing an anti-abortion, anti-immigration agenda that causes further divide in Georgia. I think we'll probably see in the next few months religious freedom come up. I'm sure we'll see at some point, more bills that steer people away from, having access to abortions. Like those are things that I think will be the litmus tests of how his how he governs and how that office influences the rest of Georgia state politics.
What do you think 2018 tells us about 2020? Democrats outperformed expectations in a midterm election year, which is traditionally a lower turnout for progressives and liberals. What can we expect out of 2020 here in Georgia?
I think the surprise of Democrats of being as competitive as they were in 2018, not just at the level of the governor's race, but also coming really close with winning PSC, potentially winning like down to ballot races with John Barrow almost getting to runoff in one of the PSC commission races, getting to runoff. I think that I am, as we were chatting about before this interview and some of your research in the way of which the Republican Party in the 80s and late 70s through Newt Gingrich kind of rebuilt itself on a state level. I think the next 2 years are going to be pivotal for how Democrats build like a similar kind of statewide infrastructure. I think, one of the things people like Johnny Isakson and Newt Gingrich, back when Republicans were the minority party in Georgia, they were able to like run people in school board races and do this kind of grassroots leadership building that is the kind of thing that really drives people to the polls. And you're starting to see some of this in Metro Atlanta. You look at the Gwinnett Council, or look at some of the newer faces at the Capitol. I look at people like Park Cannon and B. Nguyen, who are like this new generation of politicians in Metro Atlanta, and I'm curious to see how that continues over the next 2 years.
Here in Athens,
Athens
has always been, or even at the commission level, Athens has always been a progressive city, but every candidate's endorsed by the Athens for Everyone, which was came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, helped elect 5 members of the commission, which it stands to be seen what sort of legislation comes out of it, but much more progressive than even Athens has ever had. Yeah. And I wonder how that trend, as you said, develops statewide, or at least in those more cosmopolitan areas.
The other thing I think would be really fascinating is we're going back to where I grew up in Chicago. There was a governor's race there as well this year, and one of the things that, given that Chicago is a metro of more than 10 million, I think. It's 3 million in the city, 10 million Chicagoland area, whereas Atlanta is Chicago to the rest of Illinois, I've always seen as very similar to Atlanta to the rest of Georgia, with the exception, with several key exceptions. One being Atlanta is a smaller city compared to the rest of the state,
right?
And of course, just like the elements of like race and class that play out differently in the two states. But in Chicago, there's always been how Chicago goes often dictates how the governor's race and everything else. Like you can just run in Chicago for the most part and win. And that's
I'm from outside Carbondale.
Okay, yeah. So
originally, I'm from Williamson County, which is
my dad
downstate.
My dad went to Southern Illinois. He's a Salukis.
Go Salukis. Yeah. Everybody in my family goes to SIU.
So I'm curious, like going back to what we're chatting about and the widening of Democratic reach throughout Metro Atlanta as the suburbs turn blue. Will Atlanta ever get to the size of having that kind of control that Chicago does
Right.
on the rest of. I don't think we're there yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if, a 10-county area turns blue around Atlanta, if suddenly that 3 million people plus like Savannah and Columbus and Macon, if that's enough of a coalition, urban
Right.
coalition for Democrats to win. I don't think we're going to be there in 2020, but I'm really fascinated to see. I wouldn't
Sure.
be surprised either if that 10-county region looked a lot more blue than it did, in 2018.
So what do you think? David Perdue is going to be up for re-election. Perhaps President Trump's most vocal defender, especially maybe not nationally, but especially within the Georgia congressional delegation. How big of a target does he have politically in 2020?
I think if you've driven around, I don't know if you have these billboards in the Athens area or along 316, but every now and then you'll see these billboards in Metro Atlanta of like, where's David Perdue?
I have not seen those.
And
no.
And progressive activists putting those up primarily. But I think looking back at David Perdue winning 2014, that's probably the biggest precursor to Trump winning. In a sense, you had this, career business executive, one of the wealthier, probably in the top 1 or 2% of income earners in the state, putting on a jean jacket and going around the state and winning in spite of his political, because of, but also like by not playing up the fact that he was related to a former governor. Like Sonny was not as out in front in that
helped
campaign.
to have those connections, but it was not.
But the jean jacket, but the kind of adopting this like working man's persona.
The jean jacket in the farm field, that's cotton field. I think it was
outside of Macon or whatever. Like that, I'm curious to see how that resonates in 2020 when he runs. And I think, Michelle Nunn was the last of the centrist candidates. She ran a very uninspiring race that I think tried to do the exact opposite, play up her father's credentials, but also like present this like centrist, like, coalition builder, like going to end gridlock in Georgia, but it like fell on closed ears, more so than Jason Carter's message did. And I think whether it's Abrams or someone else, I think how it's going to be a really fascinating race to watch, because I think, Purdue's going to reflect, the 2020 presidential election. So if Trump gets reelected, Purdue's going to get reelected.
Sure. Yeah.
And if there's an uprising, then Purdue's probably not going to be holding that office for another 6 years. And so I'm fascinated to see who ultimately, if Abrams does take that seat, I think she'll have Purdue is going to have one hell of that's going to be one of the most competitive races in the nation. And I would say even more so than the Kemp one was, just because I think he is a lot, like Kemp was a very popular politician even before he started running in rural Georgia and Republican circles. Purdue is, I don't know, I'd be fascinated to see how he pulls off having a record. Having a record to defend what that means for his reelection bid. But
well, just as we're wrapping up, you already mentioned one of the stories that you're working on. What other stories? Any political stories or things like that you're working on?
Yeah, I've got a handful. Working on a series for the Macon Telegraph throughout 2019 on. Related to correctional facilities and private prisons in Georgia, and looking at how, as Georgia continues to be a state that has more and more private prisons, it's one of the, a state where I think 1 in 6 prisoners are held in a private facility. What does it mean for what does that mean for the quality of like healthcare for prisoners statewide, and how does that look beyond Governor Deal? Does the criminal justice system change with a new governor where that may not be the same priority as Governor Deal had, who doesn't have the same priorities as Governor Deal had?
Mm-hmm.
Or so that's one thing I'm looking at. What else? The oral history that I was telling you about with Lightning is political in the sense that it went through the state and city and was a and beyond that, we'll just have to see where the year goes.
Right. Well, the year is young, but Max, thank you very much for taking the morning to talk to us, and on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, thank you.
Thanks for taking the time.
Sure.